In 1934, a mother received a letter. It described how her missing daughter was lured, and what happened next. How the man who took her didn't just end her life. He dismembered her, cooked her, and wrote every haunting detail. This isn't a horror film. This is the true story of Albert Fish, one of the most disturbing criminals in American history. If your mind needs peace, this is your cue to stop. But if you choose to stay, then let's get into it. Edward Budd was an ambitious 18-year-old. He was determined to build a better life and escape his family's deep poverty. On May 25, 1928, he placed a classified ad in the Sunday edition of the New York World. Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street. He was strong, willing to work, and wanted to help support his family. Stuck in a small, messy apartment with his parents and 4 younger siblings, Edward just wanted a job in the countryside, somewhere calm, with fresh air and a bit of peace. On Monday, May 28th, Edward's mother, Delia, answered the door to an elderly man who introduced himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from Long Island. He said he wanted to speak with Edward about a job. Delia asked her 5-year-old daughter, Beatrice, to get Edward from his friend's place. The old man smiled and gave the little girl a nickel. While they waited, he told Delia he used to work as an interior decorator before retiring to a farm. He said he raised 6 kids alone after his wife left, and now ran a successful farm with chickens, cows, and a few workers. One farmhand was leaving, and he needed someone new. Edward soon arrived. Howard commented on his strength, and Edward promised he was a hard worker. Howard offered him $15 a week, and Edward accepted happily. He even agreed to hire Edward's friend Willie. Howard said he had to leave for an appointment but promised to return on Saturday to pick up the boys. Edward and Willie were excited, and the Budd family was relieved that such a good opportunity had come from Edward's small ad. Saturday, June 2nd, was supposed to be the big day, but Mr. Howard didn't show up. Instead, they received a handwritten note from him, saying he'd been delayed and would come by the next morning. The next morning around 11, Frank Howard showed up at the Budds' apartment, carrying strawberries and fresh pot cheese. "These are straight from my farm," he said. Delia invited him to stay for lunch. It was the first time Edward's father, Albert Budd Sr., got to speak with the man who was going to employ his son. The old man talked warmly about his 20 acres of farmland, his helpful workers, and the peaceful country life. It all sounded perfect. Exactly the kind of life Edward had hoped for. Albert Sr., a porter at the Equitable Life Assurance Company, was a quiet man who didn't say much. He wasn't too impressed by Mr. Howard's wrinkled blue suit, but the man spoke politely and seemed trustworthy. As they sat down to eat, the door opened, and 10-year-old Gracie walked in, humming a tune. She had big brown eyes, dark hair, and pale skin that made her look even more striking. She was dressed in her white silk confirmation dress, stockings, and a string of pearls. Straight from church, she looked older than her years. Howard couldn't stop staring. Then he handed her a big wad of cash. "Let's see how good you are at counting," he said. Gracie quickly counted it. $92.50. Howard smiled. What a smart little girl. He gave her 50 cents to buy candy for herself and Beatrice. The Budds were shocked by how much cash the old man had. He told the family he'd be back later that evening to pick up Edward and Willie. But first, he had to attend his niece's birthday party. He gave the boys $2 to go see a movie. Then, just before leaving, he turned to Gracie and asked if she wanted to join him at the party. "I'll take good care of her," he promised. "She'll be home by 9. Delia asked where his sister lived. "Columbus and 137th Street, he replied. Delia was hesitant, but Albert Sr. said, "Let the poor kid go. She doesn't get to have fun very often." So Delia helped Gracie into her nice coat and gray hat with the streamers. She walked her to the door and watched as Gracie and Mr. Howard disappeared down the street. That evening, there was no sign of them. No call, no word. The Budds spent a sleepless night, sick with worry. The next morning, Edward went to the police to report his sister missing. What they learned was worse than anything they'd imagined. The address Mr. Howard gave them didn't even exist. There was no sister, no birthday party, no farm in Farmingdale. There was no Frank Howard. It was all a lie. Police began their investigation by checking everything Frank Howard had told the Buds. They also reviewed their rogues gallery of photos and checked known criminals, but there was no sign of Gracie. On June 7th, New York police mailed 1,000 flyers with Gracie's photo and a description of Mr. Howard to stations across the country. This led to an influx of tips and false sightings, which kept over 20 detectives busy. A few solid clues emerged. Police traced the Western Union office in Manhattan where Howard had sent his message to the Buds. The handwriting suggested he was educated and refined. They also tracked down the pushcart where Howard had bought the pot cheese for the Buds. Both leads pointed to East Harlem, which became a focus of the search. The police were no strangers to child abductions. Before the disappearance of Gracie, there was a case a year earlier in 1927. 4-year-old Billy Gaffney had disappeared while playing outside his apartment with a neighbor. His 3-year-old friend was the only witness. He said the boogeyman had taken Billy, a strange old man with gray hair and a droopy mustache. The police dismissed it at first. Who would listen to a child? But slowly, they pieced together the details, slowly realizing the boogeyman wasn't just a fantasy. And then there was the case of Francis McDonnell, Staten Island, 1924. 8-year-old Francis had been playing outside when a strange gray-haired man approached him. Hours later, his father found him, horribly beaten, his clothes torn, strangled with his own suspenders. Despite a huge manhunt, the gray man was never found. So, with the passage of time with each dead end, the Buds' hope faded. As months went by, investigators too started to lose hope, thinking the case was lost. But Detective King, a well-known figure in New York law enforcement, never lost hope. He thought about Gracie and her parents every day and made sure to spend time on the case, chasing every lead no matter how small. He never ignored a lead that came his way. On November 11, 1934, 6 years after Gracie's disappearance, Mrs. Budd received an unsigned and anonymous letter. The letter claimed to be from a friend of someone named Captain John Davis, a seafaring man who, after a trip to China, developed a disturbing taste for human flesh. The writer claimed that Captain Davis had kidnapped 2 young boys, murdered them, and ate their bodies in unimaginable ways. The letter continued, describing how the writer, inspired by Davis, had also kidnapped Gracie under the pretense of taking her to a party. He explained that after taking her, he killed her and ate her in 9 days. The details of the act were too horrific to recount, so we refrain from going into further detail out of respect for the victims and their families. After receiving the horrific letter, Detective King, who had postponed his retirement 2 years earlier to continue working on Gracie's case, immediately took charge of the investigation. King focused on Mr. Howard's original Western Union telegram, and it was soon clear that the handwriting matched that of the letter writer. The two were the same person. King then examined the envelope under a microscope and found a barely visible design on the flap, which turned out to be the letters NYPCBA. A quick check of the Manhattan phone directory led him to the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association at 627 Lexington Avenue. The association cooperated fully, allowing King to investigate their 400 employees. Unfortunately, no matches were found. Determined not to give up, King gathered the chauffeurs and questioned them thoroughly. He also made a public appeal for any information, offering immunity for any theft of materials used in writing the letter, as his sole focus was to catch the killer. After his appeal to the chauffeurs, Detective King retreated to a private office at the association's headquarters, hoping his efforts would bear fruit. Moments later, a man in a chauffeur's uniform, Lee Sikowski, knocked on the door. Sikowski confessed he had a habit of taking the association's stationery home and using it. He mentioned he had left some unused paper and envelopes in a room he'd once rented at 622 Lexington Avenue. Detectives rushed to the location, but found nothing. King pushed Sikowski to think of other places the stationery might be, and Sikowski recalled a cheap boarding house at 200 East 52nd Street where he had spent some time. At this address was a rundown flop house. The landlady, Mrs. Frida Schneider, informed them that Sikowski's old room had recently been occupied by a man matching Frank Howard's description. His name was Albert Fish. When detectives checked the room register, they were sure the handwriting matched that of the letter writer. King learned that Fish received a monthly check from one of his sons, always sent to the 200 East 52nd Street address. Determined, King took a room in the flophouse at the top of the stairs, giving him a clear view of both the entrance and hallways, prepared to continue the hunt for the killer. Detective King waited for 3 days, and on December 13, 1934, he received an urgent call from the flophouse. He had just left to return to the station when the landlady called to inform him that Fish had returned. King rushed back to the building, and when he arrived, Mrs. Schneider explained that she had stalled Fish by offering him a cup of tea and inviting him to sit until the detective could arrive. Remaining calm, King drew his revolver and entered the room where Fish waited. To his surprise, he found a harmless-looking old man with white hair, a scraggly mustache and watery blue eyes, sipping tea. Detective King identified himself, and Fish made no attempt to hide his identity. King then asked Fish to accompany him to the police station for questioning. But just as King approached, the elderly man suddenly lunged at him, pulling a straight razor from his pocket. In a flash, King grabbed Fish's wrist and twisted it until the razor fell to the floor. Despite his frailty, Fish couldn't overpower the well-built detective, and King quickly handcuffed him. Upon searching his pockets, King found them filled with various sharp knives and razors. Turning Fish around to face him, King looked into his withered face and triumphantly declared, "I've got you now." And finally a 6-year manhunt has come to end. Detective King took Fish's confession, where Fish described being overtaken by a bloodthirst in the summer of 1928. Initially, he had planned to lure Edward Budd, not his sister Gracie, to a remote location to kill him. After leaving the Budd house, Fish bought the tools he needed for the murder, a cleaver, saw, and butcher knife. He left these tools at a newsstand before returning to the Budd home. When Fish saw Edward and his friend Willie, he believed he could overpower both of them. But after seeing Gracie, his plans changed. It was Gracie he wanted to kill. Fish clearly recalled the day he kidnapped Gracie. With her unaware of his intentions, he retrieved his tools from the newsstand and took her on a train ride to the village of Worthington. Gracie, excited about the rare trip out of the city, was unaware of the danger. In Worthington, Fish left his bundle of tools on the train. Gracie noticed and kindly retrieved it for him. They walked to a secluded area and reached Wisteria Cottage. While Gracie picked wildflowers, Fish prepared his gruesome plan. He strangled her, beheaded her, and dismembered her body. Over 9 days, he ate parts of her, grinning as he described drinking her blood and told about the place where he left her remains. When Detective King asked Fish why he committed such an atrocity, Fish responded, "I never could account for it." When asked about the letter to the Budds, Fish explained he had a mania for writing. After his capture, Albert Fish attempted to explain his disturbing behavior by blaming the traumatic conditions of his childhood. Born on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C., Fish came from a family with a long history of mental illness. His uncle was diagnosed with mania, his brother was sent to a mental institution, and his sister had her own struggles with mental health. His mother, Ellen, also suffered from visual hallucinations. When Fish was just 5 years old, his father, Randall, died of a heart attack, leaving his mother to care for him on her own. Struggling financially, she sent him to the St. John's Orphanage in Washington, where the boys were subjected to harsh treatment. This mistreatment, particularly the cruel punishments they endured, played a significant role in shaping Fish's psyche. The abusive environment led Fish to develop complex and unhealthy desires, particularly linked to the concepts of pain and pleasure. He liked to have pain and to inflict upon others too. It was during these formative years that Fish's dark impulses began to take root, influencing the horrific acts he would commit later in life. After his capture, Albert Fish was examined by several teams of doctors, and he seemed to relish the attention and notoriety that came with his case. One of the doctors who closely observed him, Dr. Frederick Wortham, later wrote about his unsettling impressions of Fish. Wortham described Fish as appearing like a meek and innocuous little old man, someone who, at first glance, could seem harmless, even benevolent. He was friendly and polite, someone you might trust with your children. Yet, as Wortham got to know him better, he began to realize that Fish was far more complex and deeply disturbed than he initially appeared. Fish was, according to Wortham, the most extreme example of a polymorphous pervert, a person who had indulged in almost every known perversion and deviation, from sadism to self-mutilation. Fish himself even confessed to some of these horrors, revealing that he had carried parts of his victim Grace's body, specifically her ears and nose, wrapped in newspaper, back to New York. He told Wortham how, as he traveled by train, he would place the bundle on his lap and feel a sense of excitement at the grisly contents inside. He claimed to have committed his heinous acts across the country, saying that he had killed at least one child in each of the 23 states he had lived in. The trial of Albert Fish for killing Gracie Budd started on March 11, 1935, in White Plains, New York. Fish was sent to Sing Sing prison. He appealed multiple times to avoid the death penalty, but all his attempts were rejected. He was scheduled to be executed on January 16, 1936. As the day approached, Fish seemed oddly calm. He even said he was looking forward to the execution, calling it the only thrill I haven't tried. On the day of his execution, Fish ate his last meal, a steak, and walked to the electric chair without any help. He sat down and helped the guards attach the electrodes to his legs. Witnesses were shocked by how relaxed he seemed, even showing a strange kind of excitement about what was coming. Fish didn't die right away. It said that the first jolt of electricity didn't kill him immediately and that smoke started to appear around him. It was because Fish had inserted needles into his body, which may have caused a short circuit. After a second, longer jolt, his body jerked, his fists clenched, and then he was pronounced dead. Afterward, Fish's defense lawyer, James Dempsey, met with reporters. He was holding Fish's final statement, which Fish had written just before his death. Dempsey wouldn't share the contents, saying it was the most disgusting thing he'd ever read and that he would never show it to anyone. Fish's execution marked the end of his horrifying life, leaving behind a legacy of shock and disgust. He was a man who showed no remorse for his crimes and even seemed to find excitement in his final moments.